Chapter 17. The Insect and the Flower. Signs of the Awakening.
Did you cause it?
Ishmant asked, returning to his seat with 2 fresh cups of herbal brew. Ishmant knew the answer but let Rexer explain. It was part of his game. His guest accepted the streaming beverage and couldn't help but laugh out loud at the old Kurawa monk's suggestion.
No, by Yelm. You flatter me, but you overestimate me if you really think I am capable of such a feat.
He replied in that deep, gravelly voice that roared from his throat.
Perhaps Osric, or the Nemesis.
Rexer took a sip from his cup before answering, pulling his lips away from the edge of the cup. The bitter broth was still a little too hot to drink. Wisps of white steam still rose from his companion's cup, embracing each other in a dance of twirling threads that lengthened and twisted until they dissipated in the air above.
It does not bear the seal of darkness. I would bet my life that if it came from them, we would have felt its nefarious effects by now.
It certainly made sense.
Who then?
I told you I'd come back with answers, Ishmant. Listen to this old Karbari riddle.
The human finished his cup and leaned against the wall, ready to listen.
An insect leaves its nest in search of food. On its flight it finds a beautiful flower with some tasty drops of nectar. The insect flies to the flower, but when it lands on the delicious liquid, it finds that its legs are stuck to the flower. The petals of the plant close around the insect and the flower devours it, leaving no trace. Tell me, what mistake has it made?
Ishmant pondered the question for a moment. He had almost forgotten how to be a disciple rather than a teacher. He carefully considered the enigma his visitor had presented to him. He was sure the answer could be found in the very lines of the riddle.
He is deceived by appearances,
he replied, somewhat cautiously, not too convinced that the answer was so obvious. His companion fixed the exiled warrior black pupils with a penetrating gaze. Then he looked away with a sigh. At that moment, Ishmant knew the worth of his answer.
Wrong,
the giant said in a solemn tone.
You have taken the easy way out, my friend.
He leaned back in his seat.
You gave the most obvious and logical answer. That is why you have failed. The solution must be sought beyond obvious appearances.
Ishmant's pupils lit up as Rex's words sparked an idea in his mind. The answer was as clear as the water from an upland spring.
Of course,
he said, his eyes sparkling as realization lit up his face.
The insect took it for granted that a flower could never harm it.
Rexer lowered his eyes to the ground with just the hint of a smile on his lips. He had almost forgotten the stature of the person sitting opposite him.
Exactly,
he exclaimed, lowering his powerful voice to a whisper.
That was its big mistake. It took the flower for granted.
He continued with renewed emphasis.
It's not that the insect was fooled by appearances. Carnivorous or not, a flower is, after all, still a flower, no more different or similar in appearance to any other. To think that something can never happen just because it seems unlikely is the greatest mistake of all. That poor little bug took it for granted that it was the one feeding on the flower and not the other way round. If we had warned it of the danger, I bet it would have treated us with disdain. It would have laughed at us. A flower that eats insects, it would have scoffed at us. Are you sure you haven't gotten drunk on some cheap tavern wine? This confidence, understandable though it was the cause of the insect's misfortune. The insect was mistaken, just as we are.
Ishmant was certain he knew what his friend was leading up to with such a specific example, but he wanted to be sure.
What do you mean?
Rexor looked away for a moment at the dense mass of books stacked on the shelves of the small library. It was not very extensive, admittedly, but was obviously well used.
I am sure you know the answer yourself.
With that, Rex arose from the armchair that had valiantly supported his massive frame, its hinges seeming to creak with relief. He stood up to his full height, his head almost touching the wooden boards of the ceiling. Everything around him seemed to shrink, as if subdued by his towering physical presence. He strode past Ishmant and went over to the worn and dusty wooden bookshelves. He carefully perused the books, tomes, and parchments, ranged before him as if they were patiently waiting for a hand to open their pages and free them from the solitude and oblivion imposed on them for so long. After a long moment of searching, he eventually pulled out an old volume with a deep blue cover. He opened it and turned the pages quickly, as if he knew what to find and where to find it. With a spontaneous expression of satisfaction, the giant's finger stopped at one of the yellowed pages. He approached Ishmant again, without taking his eyes from the text.
"Where it is,"
he announced, pointing to a fragment in the text with his finger, clad in the black leather of his glove.
"Times of war will come, sounds of battle, long hours, days of bravery, eternal night. Times of gathering will come, swords without scabbards, one seething like the blade of steel in the heart of a forge, 1,000 thirsting for blood, 12 with the light of hope, and one more of men, the chosen of the gods mentioned by Arcanareth in his riddles, has come."
The flickering light from the hearth caused the shadows to dance, their dark silhouettes leaping and falling at the whim of the crackling flames.
"And what is our role in this story?"
asked Ishmant.
"If it were to be true, if we are to believe this philosopher, he will awaken with divine blood. He does not need us."
Ishmant's words were like the sharp point of a spear thrust towards him, looking for a flaw in his armor. Another test to see if the Warden of Knowledge really was the master of his art. Rexor calmly returned to his chair.
"We make the second mistake, the mistake of the disciple. We choose the easiest and most logical way, and according to Heliocario, Arcanareth, let it be understood that it would be Alehar himself who would awaken, and that he would do so in human form. Everyone, including Heliocario himself, took it for granted that he would awaken conscious of being and aware of his nature and purpose. Who says it has to be this way? What if awakening is a process? What if it has to find a way, or someone, perhaps us, to show him his nature? This leads us to the third mistake, the mistake of the insect. We assumed that the awakened one would be born here. Where else would it be? That he would have human blood like yours in his veins. That he would be a chosen one, but he is not. We must assume the unlikely, even the impossible. He is not a chosen one. In reality, he is an envoy. From beyond it must come, from beyond he will come, say the Psalms."
"Sent?"
asked Ishmant expectantly.
"Brought, perhaps summoned, next to the gods and from the gods to fulfill a destiny. I know the verses sound strange, but they may be a sign that we are looking in the wrong place. The seventh, if it is real, comes from somewhere else. Perhaps from a different reality or plane of existence. Don't ask me to be more specific. I'm making an unprecedented effort to open my mind to mythical signs which I have never taken seriously before."
"Are you talking about a magical spell, Rexor?"
Ishmant seriously doubted the possibility.
Magic must be involved somehow. According to Heliocario, Arcanareth presented the awakening of the seventh as a wish of the gods. Could that wish be interpreted as a spell or magical event powerful enough to be felt from the pillars of the Horned One to the Synced Realm, from the solitudes of ice to the sea of sands, and beyond all coordinates and beyond?
From the expression on his face, Ishmant was clearly still skeptical about the whole thing.
"That might be a reasonable explanation for the tearing and discordance in the shroud,"
Ishmant asserted with a raised eyebrow.
"Of course, I find it hard to believe that it could be the work of mere mortals. The suggestion of a spell from the gods might make sense. if the gods actually existed. I am Clarion Rexor. We Clarions believe that the gods are merely collective mental constructs, nothing more. They do not exist as real entities. And I find it hard to admit that entities that do not actually exist could have influenced our reality.
I could not agree with you more on this point. I have to make the same extraordinary effort to believe it.
The scholar admitted with sincerity.
But it is the basis of my argument. What if we were wrong? What if much of what we thought was fable really exists? There is tangible evidence. The Levitani are real, they are out there. They can be seen and they can be touched. So the rest of the myths surrounding them could be true in some way. If one of the myths turns out to be true, what prevents the others from being true as well? Now the threads and strings in every layer of shroud have vibrated Ishmant. The magical energy in the mystical fabric that holds the world together has been disrupted. Whatever has altered it is magical in nature. It must be a spell, even if there is no sorcerer.
Rexor rubbed his eyes wearily. There was a hint of frustration in his body language.
I am the Warden of Knowledge, Venerable,
he said firmly.
My training and rank bring me much closer to your Clarion worldview than to pantheistic mythology. You know I am not a devout believer. I never have been. But try as I might to find a rational explanation for these cryptic texts, I can only interpret them from a mythological standpoint. According to Heliocario, Arcanareth clearly speaks of signs and portents that would precede the awakening. I have followed the enigmas and they could have already happened. The discordance in the shroud would be the final proof of his prophetic accuracy. Our inability to find a rational logic to it is precisely what makes it all the more firm and solid. And I know I am betraying everything I stand for by saying this, but what if the gods really did somehow send the seventh of Missal? Or more importantly, what if there really is such an awakened one, regardless of who is responsible for his arrival? Wouldn't it be worth following that lead, however far-fetched such a possibility may seem to our rational minds? In our situation, defeated and with nothing to lose, Aksai, if there is something or someone out there that can turn the tide in our favor, isn't it worth trying to find it?
Ishmant thought for a moment.
All right.
The exiled monk sighed, clearly still not completely convinced.
Let's put our faith in the prophecies of old. What do you suggest we do next?
Rexor seemed to regain some of his enthusiasm.
Something tells me we need to put everything we have learned behind us. Let's not make the mistake of the insect. If the awakened one is real, we must find him. We must show him his true nature. We must encourage him to do what he has come to do, to confront the threat of the shadow, to confront the cult that threatens peace and all existence. But like you, I know nothing. Let us follow its trail. Let us seek the source of the disturbance in the shroud, as I am sure Osric will, for I fear they will seek his destruction.
The huge Lionid sighed deeply.
The texts agree with astonishing consistency. The clerics of Kala will not delay in searching for him. They have never doubted the words of the accursed prophet. Whether they are true or not, they will Hanan. I fear he is the one piece that doesn't fit into their plans. They may even have been expecting him.
How do you think the chosen of the gods can help us?
I can't imagine yet, but I needed a purpose, a sign, and I have found it. Now I need you and the others. The rest is still darkness. But it is better to walk in darkness than to do nothing and meekly wait for death.
The hinges creaked almost imperceptibly as the wooden planks that formed the trapdoor were lifted. Beneath them, they discovered a dark flight of steps, leading down into the depths of the solid ice below. Stale air rose up the steps, assaulting their nostrils with a rancid, musty smell. Ishmant lowered the oil lamp as far as his arm would reach to illuminate the descent. The arc of light split the shadows, revealing a narrow ladder and the poles that supported it. The glare of the lamp revealed little else before fading into the prevailing darkness.
I haven't been down there in years,
Ishmant admitted to Rexor, as he looked down into the ominous black hole at his feet.
I swore I wouldn't do it without a compelling reason.
The day of your reunion has come, but
His companion affirmed in a dry and powerful tone, without taking his golden eyes away from the black hole in the ice. Ishmant motioned for his companion to follow him down. The warrior's boots began to descend into the dark interior, hidden beneath the ground, the arc of light from the lamp illuminating the way. Following in his footsteps, Rexor began his descent.
Watch out for the low beam, my friend. To your left you will find a torch on the wall.
Ishmant's forehead passed within inches of the horizontal plank that supported the floor of the dwelling that served as the roof to the underground chamber. Rexor carefully followed the wooden beam with his eyes as he bent his huge body to gain access to the chamber. Once inside, they found themselves in a chilly but dry, open area. Their nostrils were filled with the heavy, dank odor. The torch was where Ishmant had indicated. The oil was slow to ignite, but after several failed attempts, the flame of the lamp soon covered the flammable surface of the firebrand and spread across its length. The glow from the torch illuminated the gloom of their surroundings, revealing the true dimensions of the room they were in. Without the light of the torch, the chamber had appeared much larger and higher. In reality, it was a small, square crypt, dug into the ice of the Icta itself. Yet it was spacious enough for Rexor's large frame to fit comfortably within. The walls glowed brightly in the orange light of the torch, which made the walls of ice and snow glow in a mosaic of tiny crystals. The flickering tongues of flame cast long shadows of the two figures on the floor and walls. They also lengthened the shadows of the objects that were in the room, making them appear much larger than they really were.
This is the place where my past rests.
Ishmant's voice was firm and did not express any emotion, as was his custom. But behind the expressionless mask of stone, the enigmatic warrior was experiencing an intense wave of nostalgia. You had to know him well to notice. As otherwise, Ishmant's eyes showed no change.
I have been away from this place for such a long time, too many memories, Warden.
A thick vapor escaped his lips, betraying the low temperature in the chamber.
Yet I have kept alive the hope of returning here to reclaim what is mine.
Rexor paused to observe the human. Ishmant was frozen in place, seemingly absent from the world as he spoke. 1,000 thoughts rushed through the Lionid's mind. Perhaps Ishmant just needed to be told, "Get up and get going." Maybe he would never be the same man who had fled a hostile, dying world he could do nothing about. But it would be this instant that would decide everything. So, he just gazed at the human's fine hair, gathered in a long auburn braid, and the thick, warm clothes covering his slim and well-proportioned frame. He seemed so familiar and strange at the same time. The walls of the room were lined with an impressive array of weapons, displayed as if they were ornaments or treasured artifacts in some remote museum. Each one had been covered with the fresh crimson of blood on countless occasions, wielded by the very same person who now stood in front of them. Such silence and peace. Those deadly blades had been at rest for so long now, for too long. Their leather sheaths, their wooden shafts, every inch of metal forming their sharp blades all seemed asleep in an eternal slumber. Yet at any moment, they would be eager to return to the skilled hands of their owner.
They've been here, like this, since I came to this place.
Ishmant said with a tinge of regret in his voice, seeing that Rexor had approached the wall to take a closer look at the weaponry.
If spiders could survive here, they would all be covered in cobwebs by now.
The huge visitor looked back just in time to see Ishmant turn towards the opposite wall. Then the Lionid's gaze returned to the weapons. He stood before the array of blades glinting in the bright torchlight. They looked deceptively harmless, lined up against the wall. He wondered wistfully, how many battles had they fought in? One could only imagine the countless souls they had vanquished, how much blood they had spilt, how many victories they had won. Just think of the stories these weapons could tell, if only they could speak.
Don't you hear that?
Rexor asked, turning to his friend. Ishmant slowly turned to face him and listened carefully, frowning as he tried to identify any sound of movement from his surroundings. But all he could make out was the static hum of deep silence. Ishmant stared at Rexor without moving a muscle in his face. His eyes, slightly slanted and ebony black, seemed to say,
"What are you talking about, my friend?"
No, Ishmant, not out there. To them.
Rexor made a wide, sweeping gesture with his outstretched arm towards the weapons arrayed against walls.
To them, listen to the steel of your blades. I hear them, my friend. I hear them beseeching you to release them from their sheaths. Take their hilts firmly in your hand once more and feel them cut the air at your command.
The human warrior's gaze swept over the mosaic of weapons that stretched before his eyes. His mind was flooded with words and memories. Rexor seemed to understand his apprehension.
They have always been instruments of the light. Never forget that,
he said in a deep voice.
I need you by my side in this war, Venerable.
Let me think about it, Mighty One.
Rexor realized it was time to leave him.
I will wait for you upstairs. Take your time.
The flame of the torch and the light from the lantern wrestled with the shadows on icy walls, but failed to illuminate the whole of the subterranean chamber. Ishmant stepped deeper into the shadows, approaching a corner of the chamber far from the entrance. The light of his lamp revealed a small wooden chest lying on the floor beside the wall. Without a word, he searched the clothing he was wearing until he found a pendant. Ishmant reappeared before Rexor only moments later. He surged from the shadows in his usual theatrical manner, as if he were a ghost from the dead. He walked slowly, with the same grace and elegance of the elves. Unhurried, solemn, calm. His clothes were no longer the thick outer winter garments he had worn a few moments ago. Now he wore his battle gear. Many of the weapons that had once been displayed on the icy walls now hung from his belt and back. This was the image of the warrior that everyone remembered. It brought back to Rexor's memory the glorious days of yore. It was this Ishmant, and no other, that the Guardian of Knowledge had come to find. An intense feeling of excitement and emotion welled up in his chest. Their eyes met. The energy was palpable. A smile crossed the visitor's lips. He had achieved his goal. But what Rexor didn't know was that the whole conversation had been pure pantomime. Ishmant had been awaiting Rexor's arrival for a long time. Everything that had been said had been nothing more than staged theater, a conversation deliberately orchestrated to rekindle his passion and set him in motion. This warrior monk hid secrets. Beneath the cloak that now covered his face, he smiled, although Rexor could not see it. The Warden of Knowledge had begun the journey without knowing it, even if the road he took was strewn with cracks and fissures. That was not what mattered now. The change, the real change, had finally begun. It was time to act. There was no time for hesitation or delay. Rexor had come to him, not the other way round. The wheel was turning, and he had not been directly responsible for it.